They called me a parasite at my aunt's funeral. Right there in front of everyone, my cousin Marcus stood up during the eulogy and pointed his finger at me like I was some kind of disease. "Look at him," he said, his voice echoing through the chapel, "still freeloading off the family even after she's dead." The room went silent, except for my mother's approving nod and my uncle's bitter chuckle. I wanted to disappear into the wooden pew, but I couldn't move. Then the notary cleared his throat and opened Aunt Victoria's will. $15 million and 3 properties, all mine. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to where this all started. My name is Daniel, and I've been the family disappointment for as long as I can remember. While my cousins were becoming doctors and lawyers, I was struggling through art school, then bouncing between freelance graphic design jobs that barely paid rent. Every family gathering was a masterclass in humiliation. My Uncle Richard would always introduce his son Marcus as the cardiologist. My Aunt Susan would beam about her daughter's law practice, and then they'd get to me with that awkward pause before saying, "And Daniel is still figuring things out." The worst part wasn't even the constant judgment. It was watching them treat Aunt Victoria like an ATM machine. She was my mother's older sister, never married, no kids of her own, and she'd built a small fortune through smart real estate investments back when property in downtown Portland was dirt cheap. Every holiday, every birthday, every random Tuesday, someone in the family was asking her for money. My cousin Sarah needed help with her mortgage. Marcus wanted funding for his new medical practice. Uncle Richard was always pitching some business venture that needed just a small loan. But me, I never asked for anything. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was shame, but I couldn't bring myself to join the parade of relatives with their hands out. Instead, I was the one who showed up to her house every other weekend just to check on her. I'd bring groceries, help with her garden, fix whatever was broken around the house. We'd sit on her back porch drinking iced tea, and she'd tell me stories about growing up during the Depression, about how she'd learned to spot opportunity when everyone else saw only problems. Victoria wasn't just my aunt, she was the only person in my family who never made me feel like I was less than. When I dropped out of my marketing job to try freelancing, everyone else called me irresponsible. She said I was brave. When my portfolio was rejected by the 5th agency in a row, my mother suggested I get realistic about my limitations. Victoria bought 3 of my paintings and hung them in her living room. She lived alone in this beautiful craftsman house in the Hawthorne district, the kind of place that real estate agents now call charming vintage character, and price at $800,000. She'd bought it for $37,000 in 1974. The house was her pride, with its original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and a garden that looked like something from a magazine. But as she got older, maintaining it became harder, and that's where I came in. Every Saturday morning, I'd drive my beat-up Honda across town to help with whatever needed doing, cleaning gutters, weeding flower beds, organizing her basement full of antiques and memories. My family saw this as further evidence of my inability to get my life together. Still playing handyman for Aunt Vicky instead of finding a real job, Marcus would joke at family dinners. What they didn't understand was that those Saturdays were the best part of my week. Victoria would always have fresh coffee ready when I arrived, and we'd sit at her kitchen table, planning out the day's projects. She'd show me old photos, share stories about my grandmother, teach me about the different types of roses in her garden. She treated me like I mattered, like my opinions were worth hearing, like my presence was a gift rather than a burden. The rest of the family showed up differently. They came with specific agendas, asking for specific amounts, presenting business plans and sob stories. My cousin Sarah visited every few months, usually when her husband's construction company was slow and they were behind on bills. She'd bring her kids, let them run wild through Victoria's pristine house, and spend the entire visit dropping hints about how tough things were financially. Marcus was more direct. He'd arrive in his BMW, dressed in his expensive suits, treating Victoria's home like a bank branch. "I've found this incredible investment opportunity," he'd begin, pulling out glossy brochures and spreadsheets. "It's really more of a favor to you, giving you a chance to diversify your portfolio." Victoria would listen politely, nod at the right moments, and then give him some excuse about needing to think it over. Uncle Richard was the worst. He had this way of making his requests sound like he was doing Victoria a favor. "You've got all this money just sitting around earning pathetic interest," he'd argue. "Let me put it to work for you. My buddy's got this food truck concept that's going to explode. Get in on the ground floor and we'll all make a fortune." When Victoria declined, he'd get defensive, implying she was being selfish or naive about business. But I saw what they didn't see. I saw her at the kitchen table late at night, paying bills and managing her investments with a calculator and a stack of financial statements. I saw her researching every charity, reading annual reports, and visiting facilities in person. I saw her quietly helping neighbors who'd fallen on hard times, never expecting recognition or gratitude. Victoria was sharp as a tack well into her 70s, but she started slowing down around her 78th birthday. Little things at first. She'd forget where she put her reading glasses, lose track of conversations, repeat stories she'd just told. The family noticed, but only because it meant their meal ticket might be in jeopardy. The vulture started circling. Suddenly, everyone was very concerned about Victoria's mental state and her ability to manage her affairs responsibly. Marcus started showing up with pamphlets about assisted living facilities. Sarah began hinting that Victoria should consider moving closer to family. Uncle Richard actually suggested she should give him power of attorney just in case something happens. Meanwhile, I kept showing up every Saturday like always. I noticed that Victoria's handwriting was getting shakier, and she sometimes seemed confused about dates or names. But she was still herself. She still remembered every detail about my failed relationships, still asked about my latest art projects, still made the same terrible jokes that had been making me groan for 20 years. One Saturday in early October, I found her sitting in her garden looking more tired than usual. The roses were still beautiful, but she hadn't been keeping up with the deadheading, and several of the flower beds were looking neglected. She seemed smaller somehow, more fragile, like she was carrying weight she hadn't been carrying before. "I need to tell you something," she said, as we sat on the back porch after I'd finished raking leaves. Her voice was quieter than usual, more serious. "I've been thinking about the future, about what happens when I'm not around anymore." I started to protest, but she held up her hand. "I'm 80 years old, Daniel. I'm not planning on going anywhere soon, but I'm not stupid either." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She told me she'd been watching the family's behavior, how their visits had become more frequent and more focused on her finances, how Marcus had started asking pointed questions about her will, how Sarah had begun making comments about the waste of her living alone in such a big house, how Uncle Richard had actually suggested she was becoming incompetent and needed someone to manage her money. "They think I don't see what they're doing," she said, staring out at her garden. "They think I'm some doddering old fool who doesn't understand that they're already planning how to spend my money before I'm even dead." Her voice was bitter in a way I'd never heard before. "But I see everything. I've always seen everything." That conversation stayed with me for weeks. I started paying closer attention during family gatherings, watching how my relatives interacted with Victoria. The pattern was unmistakable. They'd arrive with their families, make small talk for exactly long enough to seem polite, then find ways to work their financial situations into the conversation. The kids needed new laptops for school. The house needed a new roof. The business was expanding and required additional capital. Victoria would listen with that same patient smile, asking thoughtful questions, expressing appropriate concern, but she never committed to anything. She developed this talent for deflecting requests without actually saying no, keeping everyone hopeful without actually helping anyone. I wondered if she'd always been this way, or if she'd learned to be cautious through years of being treated like a walking inheritance. Thanksgiving that year was particularly uncomfortable. The whole family gathered at Uncle Richard's house, and the undercurrent of financial desperation was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus had recently expanded his cardiology practice and was over-leveraged on equipment loans. Sarah's husband had been injured on a construction site and was facing months of reduced income. Even my mother, who usually stayed out of the family money conversations, was dealing with unexpected car repairs and home maintenance costs. Victoria arrived looking elegant as always, wearing the pearl necklace that had been my grandmother's and a navy dress that probably cost more than I made in a month. She brought homemade dinner rolls and a bottle of wine that Uncle Richard immediately looked up on his phone to check the price. Throughout dinner, I watched my family perform their usual dance of subtle manipulation and not so subtle hints. "It's just so hard these days," Sarah sighed, cutting her turkey into precise pieces. "Everything costs so much more than it used to. Sometimes I wonder how people on fixed incomes manage." She glanced meaningfully at Victoria, who nodded sympathetically while continuing to eat. Marcus took a different approach, launching into a detailed explanation of his investment portfolio and how well his diversified approach was performing. "Of course, you need significant capital to really take advantage of the good opportunities," he said, as if Victoria wasn't sitting right there with more capital than the rest of us combined. Uncle Richard was the most obvious, actually pulling out his phone during dessert to show Victoria photos of a lake house that was going for a steal because the owners needed to sell quickly. "It would be perfect for family gatherings," he said, enlarging the pictures with his thick fingers. "Imagine having the whole family up there for holidays. Of course, it would take someone with vision and available funds to make it happen." Through it all, Victoria smiled and nodded and asked polite questions, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. She was taking notes, mental notes, cataloging every request, every hint, every assumption about her money. And I realized that she was just as tired of being seen as a resource rather than a person as I was tired of being seen as a failure. After dinner, I helped Victoria to her car while everyone else was arguing over football in the living room. "Thank you for walking me out," she said, adjusting her coat against the November chill. "It gets a little overwhelming in there sometimes." I knew she wasn't talking about the noise. "They mean well," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Victoria looked at me with that sharp intelligence that age hadn't dimmed at all. "Do they?" she asked. "Or do they mean well for themselves?" She patted my arm before getting into her car. "You're the only one who comes to see me without wanting something, Daniel. Don't think I haven't noticed." Winter was brutal that year. Portland got hit with an ice storm that knocked out power for thousands of people and made driving treacherous for weeks. I was worried about Victoria being alone in that big house, so I started checking on her more frequently. Sometimes I'd find her sitting in the dark, wrapped in blankets, because she didn't want to bother anyone by calling for help with her furnace. The rest of the family was dealing with their own storm-related problems and seemed to forget that Victoria might need assistance too. Marcus's medical practice lost thousands of dollars when they had to cancel appointments during the worst of the weather. Sarah's roof started leaking and the repair estimates were astronomical. Uncle Richard's car slid off the road and needed extensive bodywork. But somehow, none of them thought to check on the 80-year-old woman living alone across town. That fell to me, the family parasite, who didn't have anything more important to do with my time. I spent 3 days that February staying at Victoria's house, sleeping on her couch, making sure her pipes didn't freeze and that she had enough food and medication. We played cards by candlelight and talked about everything and nothing. She told me about her childhood during the Depression, how her family had lost almost everything, but somehow stayed together. She talked about the men she'd almost married, the children she'd chosen not to have, the career she'd built in real estate when women weren't supposed to understand money and property. "I never regretted not having kids," she said one evening as we sat by her fireplace, the power still out from the storm. "But I always wondered what it would be like to have someone who cared about me for who I am, not what I could give them." She looked at me across the flickering candlelight. "Now, I know." That comment stuck with me for months. I started thinking about my role in the family, about how I'd been labeled the failure, the disappointment, the one who couldn't get his life together. But maybe, in Victoria's eyes, I was something different. Maybe I was the one who showed up. Maybe I was the one who cared. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, Victoria seemed to have more energy. She started working in her garden again, planning new flower beds, talking about repainting the kitchen. I thought maybe the difficult winter was behind us and things were getting back to normal. I was wrong. In April, Victoria had what the doctors called a minor cardiac event. Not a full heart attack, but a warning sign that couldn't be ignored. She spent 3 days in the hospital while they ran tests and adjusted medications, and suddenly every member of the family was deeply concerned about her health and well-being. Marcus, being a cardiologist, appointed himself her primary medical advisor and started discussing treatment options with her doctors. Sarah began researching home health aid services and gently suggesting that Victoria might be safer with someone checking on her daily. Uncle Richard started floating the idea that maybe it was time for Victoria to simplify her living situation. I was the one who picked her up from the hospital and drove her home. I was the one who helped her get settled back into her routine, made sure her medications were organized properly, and checked that all her follow-up appointments were scheduled. But according to the family narrative, I was still just the unemployed nephew with nothing better to do. The hospital incident changed something in Victoria, though. She seemed more determined, more focused, like she'd been reminded that time was finite and decisions couldn't be postponed indefinitely. She started making mysterious phone calls, scheduling appointments with people she wouldn't identify, asking me to help organize documents and files that she'd never been interested in organizing before. One day in May, she asked me to help her go through a trunk in her attic that she hadn't opened in decades. Inside were documents dating back to the 1970s, property deeds, investment records, old tax returns, and a collection of handwritten letters tied with ribbon. As we sorted through the papers, she told me stories about each property she'd bought, each investment she'd made, each decision that had built her substantial wealth. "I want you to understand something," she said as we sat surrounded by the evidence of her financial acumen. "I didn't get lucky. I didn't inherit this money. I earned every dollar through careful planning, smart investments, and a lot of hard work. Nobody in this family seems to remember that. They act like I'm just some old woman sitting on a pile of cash that fell from the sky." She pulled out a folder filled with what looked like legal documents. "I've been making some changes," she said quietly, "some decisions about the future that I should have made years ago." She wouldn't tell me what kind of changes, but something in her tone made me think they were significant. Summer passed quickly. Victoria seemed stronger, more like her old self, but also more secretive. She started declining some family invitations, claiming she was too tired or had other commitments. When people asked what commitments, she'd just smile and change the subject. Marcus was getting frustrated with her evasiveness, especially when it came to discussions about her medical care and living situation. The tension came to a head at Uncle Richard's birthday party in August. The whole family was there, along with some of his business associates and neighbors. Victoria arrived looking beautiful as always, but I noticed she seemed to be observing everything and everyone with unusual intensity. She was quieter than normal, participating in conversations but not initiating them. After dinner, Marcus cornered Victoria on the back patio and started what he probably thought was a subtle intervention about her living situation. "We've all been talking," he began, using the tone he probably used with patients who needed to be convinced to follow medical advice. "And we think it might be time to consider some changes. You're not getting any younger, and after that incident in April, we're concerned about you being alone in that big house." Sarah joined the conversation, nodding seriously. "There are some wonderful retirement communities now," she added, "places where you'd have social activities, medical care on site, and no worries about maintenance or upkeep. And think of how much easier it would be for all of us to visit you regularly." Uncle Richard appeared with a brochure that he'd apparently been carrying around waiting for the right moment. "I took the liberty of getting some information about Sunset Manor," he said, handing her the glossy pamphlet. "Top-rated facility, beautiful grounds, and they have an opening in their independent living section. Of course, it's not cheap, but with your resources, money shouldn't be an issue." Victoria listened politely, examining the brochure with the same attention she gave everything else. "This looks lovely," she said finally, "but I'm quite happy in my own home. I've lived there for almost 50 years. All my memories are there." "But memories don't help when you fall and break a hip," Marcus pressed, "or when you have another cardiac episode and there's nobody around to call for help. We're thinking about your safety, your quality of life." "Are you?" Victoria asked quietly. "Or are you thinking about how much easier it would be to manage my affairs if I were tucked away somewhere convenient?" The conversation stopped cold. Marcus looked genuinely shocked, as if he couldn't believe Victoria would question their motives so directly. "I don't appreciate the implication," he said stiffly. "We're trying to help you make responsible decisions about your future." Victoria folded the brochure neatly and handed it back to Uncle Richard. "I appreciate your concern," she said, standing up from her patio chair. "But I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my future, and I have been making them." That cryptic comment hung in the air as she gathered her purse and said her goodbyes. I offered to walk her to her car, and during the short trip across Uncle Richard's driveway, she was unusually quiet. As she unlocked her car door, she looked back at the house where the party was still going on. "They think they're so clever," she said softly, "planning out my life like I'm not even here to have an opinion about it." She turned to me with a sad smile. "Do you know what the cruelest part is? They're so busy figuring out how to benefit from my death that they've stopped seeing me as a living person." Fall arrived early that year, and with it came a noticeable change in Victoria's health. She was moving more slowly, getting tired more easily, and had started using a cane when she walked longer distances. The family interpreted this as further evidence that she needed to be in assisted living, but I saw it differently. She seemed to be preparing for something, tying up loose ends, making peace with whatever was coming. In October, she asked me to help her clean out her basement, a project we'd been postponing for months. The basement was like an archaeological dig through her life, layers of possessions and memories dating back decades. We found boxes of her mother's china, my grandfather's tools, photo albums from family trips I barely remembered, and file folders full of business correspondence from her real estate career. As we worked, Victoria seemed to be making mental notes about everything we found. She'd pick up an item, hold it for a moment, then place it in one of 3 piles: keep, donate, or throw away. But she also started a 4th pile, things she set aside without explanation. When I asked about that pile, she just said she had special plans for those items. The work was exhausting for both of us, but Victoria seemed energized by the process of organizing her possessions. "I don't want to leave a mess for other people to clean up," she explained when I suggested we could finish the project later. "I've seen what happens when someone dies without getting their affairs in order. The family fights over everything, valuable or not, and it tears relationships apart." That comment made me wonder what she was planning, but every time I tried to ask direct questions, she'd deflect with humor or change the subject entirely. All I knew for certain was that she was being much more methodical about organizing her life than she'd ever been before. November brought the first serious cold snap of the season, and Victoria caught a respiratory infection that lingered for weeks. The family rallied around her with the kind of attention they'd never shown when she was healthy, visiting regularly, bringing soup, insisting on driving her to medical appointments. But I noticed that their concern always seemed to include subtle questions about her will, her financial planning, her thoughts about the future. Victoria recovered from the infection, but she seemed frailer afterward, more vulnerable. She started talking about Christmas plans earlier than usual, asking everyone what they wanted, discussing menus and decorations. But there was something different about the way she talked about the holidays, as if she were planning a finale rather than just another family gathering. 2 weeks before Christmas, Victoria called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual because she almost never made phone calls after 8 o'clock. "I need you to come over tomorrow," she said without preamble. "There's something important I need to discuss with you." Her voice sounded formal, official, nothing like our usual casual conversations. When I arrived at her house the next day, I found her sitting at her kitchen table with a stack of documents spread out in front of her. She was dressed more formally than usual, wearing the same navy dress she'd worn to Thanksgiving dinner, with her grandmother's pearl necklace and matching earrings. She looked like she was going to an important meeting. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I want to tell you about the changes I've been making." For the next hour, she explained that she'd been working with her attorney to update her will, reorganize her investments, and establish a trust that would manage her affairs after her death. She'd also been making arrangements for her funeral, choosing a cemetery plot, and writing detailed instructions for how she wanted her possessions distributed. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what's going to happen," she said, her hands folded carefully on top of the documents, "and because I want you to be prepared for how the family is going to react." She wouldn't tell me the specific details of her new will, but she did say that she'd made provisions for everyone in the family, while also ensuring that her true wishes would be respected. "I've thought carefully about who has earned what," she said with a slight smile, "and I've made decisions that might surprise some people." That conversation left me feeling unsettled for days. Victoria seemed to be preparing for her death in a way that suggested she knew something the rest of us didn't. But when I asked her directly if she was sicker than she was letting on, she just laughed and said she was planning ahead like any responsible adult should. Christmas Eve arrived gray and cold, with the kind of drizzle that makes Portland winters feel endless. The family gathered at Victoria's house for our traditional celebration, and she seemed more animated than she'd been in weeks. She decorated the house beautifully, prepared her famous prime rib dinner, and gave everyone thoughtful, expensive gifts. But there was something ceremonial about the evening, as if she were hosting a farewell party disguised as a holiday celebration. During dinner, she raised her wine glass and made a toast that I'll never forget. "To family," she said, looking around the table at each of us. "The people who know us best and love us anyway. And to the future, whatever it may bring." Everyone drank to the toast, but I noticed Victoria barely sipped her wine. She spent most of the evening watching us, memorizing faces, storing up final memories. After everyone left that night, I stayed to help with the dishes and cleanup. Victoria seemed exhausted but satisfied, like someone who had completed an important task. "That was a good Christmas," she said as we loaded the last plates into the dishwasher. "Maybe the best one yet." I went home that night with a heavy feeling in my chest, as if something significant had ended without my realizing it. I called Victoria the next morning to check on her, and she sounded tired but happy. "Thank you for staying to help," she said. "It meant more to me than you know." That was the last conversation I had with her. 3 days later, my mother called at 6 in the morning to tell me that Victoria had died peacefully in her sleep. The family was gathering at Uncle Richard's house to make arrangements, and I should come as soon as possible. I drove across town in a daze, trying to process the reality that Victoria was gone. She'd seemed frail lately, but not dying, not ready to leave. But as I thought back over the past few months, I realized that she'd been saying goodbye in 100 small ways. The basement cleaning, the formal conversation about her affairs, the ceremonial feeling of Christmas Eve. She'd been preparing all of us, even if we hadn't understood what she was doing. The family was already in full planning mode when I arrived at Uncle Richard's house. Marcus had taken charge of coordinating with the funeral home, Sarah was handling the obituary and flower arrangements, and Uncle Richard was making calls to Victoria's attorney and financial advisor. Everyone was moving with the efficient purpose of people who'd been preparing for this moment, even if they hadn't admitted it to themselves. "We need to schedule a meeting with her lawyer as soon as possible," Marcus was saying as I walked into the living room. "There are going to be a lot of details to sort out, and we should get the process started right away." He looked up when he saw me. "Oh, Daniel, good, you're here. We're making arrangements for Victoria's funeral." The next few days blurred together in the usual chaos of death and bureaucracy. The funeral home, the cemetery, the florist, the caterer. Victoria had left detailed instructions for her service, including specific music, readings, and flowers. She'd even chosen the dress she wanted to wear and left money to pay for everything. The family interpreted this as another example of her thoughtfulness, but I wondered if it was her way of maintaining control over her story even after death. The funeral was scheduled for the following Monday, and the whole extended family was planning to attend. Victoria had been well known in her neighborhood and business community, so we expected a good turnout. What we didn't expect was the presence of a notary public with a sealed envelope and instructions to read Victoria's will immediately following the service. Monday morning arrived cold and bright, the kind of winter day that makes everything look sharp and clean. The funeral home was packed with mourners, including many faces I didn't recognize. Victoria had touched more lives than any of us realized, and the service was a beautiful tribute to the woman she'd been. The pastor read from her favorite psalms, Marcus delivered a eulogy that focused on her generosity and family devotion, and Sarah shared memories of childhood visits to Victoria's house. But throughout the service, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing from the eulogies. They talked about Victoria's kindness, her success in business, her devotion to family. But they didn't talk about her intelligence, her wit, her independence. They didn't mention how she'd maintained her dignity even when everyone around her was treating her like a checkbook with legs. They were eulogizing the Victoria they'd wanted her to be, not the Victoria she actually was. After the service, the family gathered in the funeral home's conference room for the reading of the will. Marcus seemed confident, almost jovial, as if he were attending a celebration rather than a legal proceeding. Sarah was comparing notes with her husband about renovation plans for Victoria's house, apparently assuming she'd inherit the property. Uncle Richard was on his phone researching investment strategies for the windfall he was expecting. I sat quietly in the back of the room, remembering Victoria's comment about being prepared for how the family was going to react. The notary, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, entered the room carrying a thick envelope sealed with red wax. She introduced herself formally, verified everyone's identity, and then began to read. The will started with standard legal language and small bequests to various charities and organizations Victoria had supported. She left her jewelry to Sarah, her books to Marcus, and her garden tools to Uncle Richard. These gifts were received with polite smiles and appropriate expressions of gratitude, but everyone was clearly waiting for the main event, the distribution of her substantial financial assets and real estate holdings. Then came the section that changed everything. "To my nephew Daniel," the notary read in her clear professional voice, "who showed me kindness without expecting rewards, who visited me for my company rather than my money, and who treated me as a person rather than an inheritance, I leave the remainder of my estate." The room went silent. Marcus stopped smiling. Sarah's mouth fell open. Uncle Richard actually dropped his phone. The notary continued reading, detailing the specific assets: Victoria's house and all its contents, her rental property in Southeast Portland, her vacation cabin on the Oregon coast, her investment portfolio worth approximately $12 million, her savings accounts totaling another $3 million, and the remainder of her liquid assets. $15 million and 3 properties, all left to the family parasite who couldn't get his life together. But Victoria wasn't finished. The notary pulled out a second document, a letter Victoria had written to be read after the will. "I know this distribution will surprise some of you," the letter began. "You may feel that Daniel doesn't deserve this inheritance, that he hasn't earned it through traditional success or responsible behavior. But I want you to understand the criteria I used in making this decision." The notary's voice was steady as she read Victoria's words, but I could feel the temperature in the room dropping with each sentence. "For the past 5 years, I have been carefully observing how each member of my family treats me. I've noted who visits me because they enjoy my company and who visits me because they want something. I've paid attention to who offers help without being asked and who shows up only when they need a favor. I've watched who treats me with respect and who treats me like a burden to be managed." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sarah was staring at her hands. Uncle Richard had grown pale. "Daniel has spent hundreds of hours helping me maintain my home, my garden, and my independence. He has never asked me for money, never hinted that I should help him financially, never treated me as anything other than his aunt who he cares about. When I was in the hospital, he was the one who picked me up and made sure I had everything I needed. When the ice storm knocked out my power, he stayed at my house for 3 days to make sure I was safe." The letter went on to detail specific examples of my care and attention, contrasted with specific examples of how other family members had approached their relationship with Victoria. She'd been keeping careful mental records of every interaction, every request, every assumption about her money and her future. "I am not rewarding Daniel for being unsuccessful in conventional terms," the letter concluded. "I am rewarding him for being successful in the ways that matter most: kindness, loyalty, and genuine love. The rest of you have already received your inheritance from me in the form of the loans I never expected to be repaid, the gifts I gave without being asked, and the financial support I provided whenever you needed it. Daniel never took any of that support, so he gets what's left." The silence that followed was deafening. I sat frozen in my chair, trying to process what had just happened. $15 million, 3 properties, the freedom to never worry about money again, to pursue my art without starving, to live without the constant anxiety of financial insecurity. But the money wasn't what hit me hardest. It was the recognition, the validation, the public acknowledgement that my care and attention had mattered to someone. Victoria had seen what I'd been doing all those years, had understood that my visits weren't charity work or family obligation. They were love, and she'd loved me back. Marcus was the first to find his voice. "This is ridiculous," he said, his face flushed with anger. "Daniel's never held a steady job, never supported himself, never shown any responsibility with money. How can she leave everything to someone who's going to waste it all?" Sarah joined in immediately. "There has to be some mistake. Victoria always talked about keeping the family property in the family, about making sure her legacy was protected. She can't have meant to give everything to... She gestured helplessly in my direction. Uncle Richard was more direct. "We're going to contest this," he announced, standing up from his chair. Victoria wasn't thinking clearly in her final months. This will is the result of manipulation and undue influence. No competent person would make such an irresponsible decision. The notary gathered her papers calmly, apparently accustomed to this type of reaction. "You're certainly free to contest the will in court," she said. "But I should mention that Mrs. Victoria Harper had this will reviewed by 3 different attorneys and underwent a mental competency evaluation just 2 months ago. She was very thorough in protecting her final wishes." As the family began to argue among themselves about legal strategies and grounds for challenging the will, I quietly left the conference room. I walked out of the funeral home into the cold afternoon air, got in my car, and drove to Victoria's house. My house now, I supposed, though that reality would take time to sink in. I sat in her driveway for a long time, looking at the Craftsman house with its beautiful windows and wraparound porch. The rose garden was dormant for winter, but I could imagine how it would look in spring, full of the flowers Victoria had loved so much. I thought about all the Saturday mornings I'd spent here, all the conversations we'd had, all the small acts of service that had apparently meant more to her than I'd ever realized. My phone started buzzing with angry text messages from family members, but I turned it off without reading them. For the first time in years, I didn't have to worry about their opinions of me. I had resources now, independence, the ability to make my own choices without constantly calculating the financial consequences. But more importantly, I had Victoria's final gift, the knowledge that someone had seen who I really was and had chosen to love that person. In a family that had always made me feel like I wasn't enough, she had made me feel like I was everything. I unlocked the front door and walked into the house that had been my second home for so many years. The familiar smell of lavender and old wood welcomed me, but everything felt different now. The furniture was the same, the photograph on the mantel hadn't moved, but the house felt heavier somehow, weighted with responsibility and memory. I walked through the rooms slowly, seeing them with new eyes. The living room where Victoria and I had played countless games of Scrabble. The kitchen where she'd taught me to make her famous apple pie. The study where she'd shown me her investment portfolios and explained how compound interest could build wealth over decades. Every corner held a memory, and now every corner belonged to me. The magnitude of what had just happened was starting to sink in. I wasn't just inheriting money and property, I was inheriting Victoria's life's work. Her careful accumulation of assets, her strategic planning, her legacy. She'd spent 50 years building this wealth, and now she was trusting me to be a good steward of what she'd created. My phone buzzed again, and this time I looked at the messages. They were exactly what I expected. Marcus demanding that I do the right thing and share the inheritance equally among all family members. Sarah insisting that Victoria couldn't have been thinking clearly when she made these decisions. Uncle Richard threatening legal action and claiming I'd manipulated a sick old woman. But there was also a message from an unknown number that made me pause. Mr. Harper, this is Janet Morrison from Morrison & Associates. I was Mrs. Victoria Harper's attorney. Could you please call me at your earliest convenience? There are additional matters we need to discuss regarding her estate. I called the number immediately, my hands shaking slightly as I dialed. Janet Morrison had a warm but professional voice, and she got straight to the point. Mrs. Harper left very specific instructions about what should happen after the will reading, she said. She anticipated that there might be some family discord, and she wanted me to provide you with additional information that might be helpful. She asked if I could come to her office the next morning, and I agreed immediately. I spent the rest of the evening walking through Victoria's house, trying to process everything that had happened. I made myself dinner in her kitchen, sat in her favorite chair, and tried to imagine what she would want me to do with this unexpected gift. The next morning, I drove downtown to Janet Morrison's law office, a sleek building that suggested successful practice and expensive hourly rates. Janet herself was a woman in her early 50s with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She welcomed me into her office and offered coffee before getting down to business. Victoria was one of my most thorough clients, Janet began, opening a thick file folder. She spent months planning not just the distribution of her assets, but the protection of those assets from potential challenges. She was very concerned about how her family might react to her final wishes. Janet pulled out several documents and spread them across her desk. The first was a detailed psychiatric evaluation conducted by Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a respected geriatric psychiatrist, just 8 weeks before Victoria's death. The evaluation concluded that Victoria was mentally competent, showed no signs of dementia or cognitive impairment, and was fully capable of making complex financial decisions. She wanted to make absolutely certain that no one could claim she wasn't of sound mind when she updated her will, Janet explained. Dr. Chen conducted extensive testing over multiple sessions. Victoria's cognitive function was actually above average for her age group. The second document was even more comprehensive, a detailed log Victoria had kept for over 2 years, documenting every interaction she'd had with family members. She'd recorded dates, times, and detailed descriptions of conversations, including specific requests for money and the circumstances surrounding each request. I read through several entries, feeling a mixture of amazement and sadness. Victoria had been more aware of the family dynamics than any of us had realized. She'd noted patterns of behavior, tracked promises that were never kept, and recorded instances of manipulation and emotional pressure that I'd never even noticed. One entry from the previous Christmas stood out. Marcus arrived at 2:30 p.m., stayed for exactly 90 minutes, spent first 15 minutes making small talk, then transitioned to discussion of his practice expansion needs, requested $200,000 for new equipment, promised 8% return on investment, left immediately after I said I needed time to consider, did not help with cleanup or spend time with other family members. Another entry from last spring was even more pointed. Sarah called crying about roof repairs, said insurance wouldn't cover storm damage, needed $15,000 immediately or house would be condemned, agreed to provide funds. Later discovered through neighbor that she used money for kitchen renovation. When confronted, claimed kitchen was part of storm damage. Did not apologize for deception. Victoria was a very intelligent woman, Janet said as I continued reading through the log. She understood that her family saw her as a source of financial support rather than a person deserving of love and respect. This documentation was her way of protecting herself and ultimately protecting you. The third document was a comprehensive financial audit conducted by an independent accounting firm. Victoria had hired them to review her books and verify that all the loans and gifts she'd given to family members over the years had been properly documented. The total was staggering, over $400,000 in loans that had never been repaid, plus additional gifts for emergencies, business ventures, and family celebrations. She considered this advanced distribution of her estate, Janet explained. In her mind, each family member had already received their inheritance through these previous gifts and loans. You were the only one who had never asked for or received any financial support. Janet pulled out one final document that made my heart race. A sealed envelope with my name written in Victoria's careful handwriting. She asked me to give you this after you've had a chance to review the other materials, Janet said. She wanted you to understand the full scope of what she was dealing with before you read her personal message to you. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a handwritten letter several pages long, along with a small brass key. "My dearest Daniel," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then you've inherited not just my money and property, but also my problems. I'm sorry to burden you with the family's anger and resentment, but I hope you'll understand why I made the choices I did." The letter went on to explain Victoria's reasoning in much more detail than the statement read at the funeral. She wrote about watching the family's behavior change over the years as her wealth became more apparent. She described feeling increasingly isolated as relatives began treating her like a bank rather than a person. "I used to look forward to family gatherings," she wrote, "but in recent years every conversation seemed to revolve around money. My health, my living situation, my future plans, everything was discussed in terms of how it might affect my ability to continue supporting everyone financially. I felt like I was being managed rather than loved." She wrote about the loneliness of being seen primarily as a resource and how my regular visits had been a lifeline for her. "You came to see me because you wanted to spend time with me, not because you needed something from me. You listened to my stories, helped with my chores, and treated me like I was still a person worth knowing. That meant everything to me." The letter also included practical advice about managing the inheritance. Victoria had worked with financial advisors to create a diversified portfolio that could provide substantial income while preserving the principal. She'd structured the investments to be relatively simple to manage, with clear instructions about when to buy, sell, or hold various assets. "I don't want this money to become a burden for you the way it became a burden for me," she wrote. "Use it to create the life you want, pursue your art, help people who need it. But don't let it change who you are, and don't let other people's reactions to it poison your relationships." The brass key, she explained, opened a safe deposit box at her bank that contained additional documents, including the original copies of all the loans she'd made to family members, photographs and videos she'd taken documenting her living conditions when the family claimed she needed help, and a detailed timeline of events leading up to her decision to change her will. "I hope you never need these materials," the letter concluded. "But if the family challenges your inheritance or tries to paint me as an incompetent old woman who was manipulated, you'll have everything you need to defend my final wishes and your right to receive what I've left you." Janet waited patiently while I read through the entire letter, occasionally refilling my coffee cup or offering tissues when the emotion became overwhelming. When I finally finished reading, she leaned forward with a serious expression. "Victoria was preparing for war," Janet said bluntly. "She knew the family would be angry, and she knew they'd probably try to overturn the will. She spent 2 years building an absolutely airtight case for her mental competency and your worthiness of an heir." She explained that Victoria had also hired a private investigator to document the family's treatment of her, including surveillance footage of relatives searching through her house during visits, recordings of phone conversations where they discussed her finances without her knowledge, and financial records showing how they'd used the money she'd given them. "The evidence is overwhelming," Janet said. "If your family tries to contest this will, they're going to face not just the normal burden of proving mental incompetency, but a mountain of documentation showing that Victoria was not only competent, but also completely justified in her decision-making." I left Janet's office feeling emotionally drained, but also strangely empowered. Victoria hadn't just left me money, she'd left me the tools to protect that inheritance from people who felt entitled to it. She'd anticipated every argument the family might make and prepared counter-arguments supported by professional documentation. But I also felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. This wasn't just a windfall I could spend carelessly. It was Victoria's life's work, and she was trusting me to honor her memory by using it wisely. Over the next few days, the family's reaction intensified. Marcus hired an attorney and began making formal threats about contesting the will. Sarah started calling mutual friends and extended family members, trying to build sympathy for her position that Victoria had been confused and manipulated. Uncle Richard actually showed up at the house one evening, demanding that I return property that belonged to the family. I let him rant for about 10 minutes before calmly showing him copies of the psychiatric evaluation, the financial audit, and selected pages from Victoria's log of family interactions. His bluster deflated quickly when he saw the level of documentation Victoria had compiled. "She was keeping records on us?" he asked, his voice smaller than it had been moments before. "She was protecting herself," I replied, "and apparently she was right to do so." But the pressure wasn't just coming from family members. The news of Victoria's unusual will had somehow leaked to the local media, and I started getting calls from reporters wanting to write human interest stories about the family outcast who'd inherited millions. Real estate agents began leaving messages about selling the properties. Investment advisors pitched their services for managing the portfolio. Everyone, it seemed, wanted something from me now that I had something to give. I was getting a taste of what Victoria had experienced for years, and I understood better why she'd become so careful about trusting people's motives. The breaking point came 2 weeks after the funeral. I was at Victoria's house, going through her personal belongings and trying to decide what to keep and what to donate when I heard breaking glass from the kitchen. I ran toward the sound and found Uncle Richard standing in the middle of the room, having apparently thrown one of Victoria's antique teacups against the wall. "This is insane!" he was shouting, his face red with rage. "You can't just waltz in here and take everything that should belong to all of us. Victoria was family to me long before you were even born." "You broke into my house," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I'm calling the police." "Your house?" he laughed bitterly. "This will never be your house. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win. And then you'll go back to being the family failure you always were." But as I reached for my phone, Uncle Richard's expression changed from anger to something that looked almost like fear. "Wait," he said, holding up his hands. "Don't call the police. Let's talk about this like adults." He sat down heavily at Victoria's kitchen table, suddenly looking much older than his 63 years. "Do you have any idea what this inheritance means to the rest of us?" he asked, his voice quiet now. "Marcus has debt from his practice expansion. Sarah's husband hasn't worked in months. I've got a mortgage I can barely afford and retirement savings that won't last 5 years. "And you think Victoria didn't know that?" I asked, still holding my phone but not yet dialing. "You think she wasn't aware of everyone's financial situation when she made her decision?" Uncle Richard stared at his hands folded on the table in front of him. "We never meant to, like a bank account," he said slowly. "But she had so much money, and we had so many problems. It seemed natural to ask for help when we needed it." "When was the last time you asked how she was feeling instead of asking for money?" I challenged him. "When was the last time you spent time with her without wanting something?" He couldn't answer, and we both knew why. The family had gotten into the habit of seeing Victoria as a resource rather than a person, and that habit had gradually eroded their ability to have genuine relationships with her. "I loved her," Uncle Richard said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was my big sister, and I loved her. But I also needed her help, and maybe I let the needing become more important than the loving." I sat down across from him at the table, feeling some of my anger dissipate. "She knew you loved her," I said, "but she also knew that your love came with conditions and expectations. Mine didn't." We sat in silence for several minutes, surrounded by the broken pieces of the teacup and the weight of years of complicated family dynamics. Finally, Uncle Richard looked up at me with tired eyes. "What are you going to do with all this money?" he asked. I'd been thinking about that question constantly since the will reading, and I was starting to have some answers. "I'm going to use it the way Victoria would have wanted," I said. "I'm going to be careful with it, invest it wisely, and use it to help people who actually need help." "And the family?" he asked. "Are you just going to cut us all off completely?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "Victoria didn't cut you off," I said. "She just stopped being your personal bank. If you want to have a relationship with me based on something other than my ability to solve your financial problems, I'm open to that. But I'm not going to become the family ATM just because I inherited Victoria's role." Uncle Richard nodded slowly, seeming to understand that this was the best offer he was going to get. He helped me clean up the broken teacup, apologized for breaking into the house, and left without asking for anything else. It was the most honest conversation I'd ever had with him. But not everyone in the family was ready to accept the new reality. Marcus escalated his legal challenge, claiming that I'd used undue influence to manipulate Victoria into changing her will. He hired an expensive attorney and began demanding depositions from Victoria's doctors, neighbors, and anyone else who'd had contact with her in her final months. Sarah took a different approach, launching a social media campaign designed to paint me as a greedy opportunist who'd taken advantage of a vulnerable elderly woman. She posted old photos of Victoria with captions about how family vultures had destroyed her final years, shared articles about elder abuse, and encouraged people to share their own stories about inheritance disputes. The campaign was effective enough to attract more media attention, and I found myself being portrayed in some outlets as either a devoted nephew who'd been unfairly maligned or a calculating manipulator who'd stolen millions from his own family. The truth, as usual, was more complicated than either narrative allowed. The stress of the legal battle and media attention was taking its toll. I'd moved into Victoria's house partly for security reasons and partly because it felt like the right thing to do. But I was having trouble sleeping in rooms filled with memories of our conversations about family loyalty and betrayal. Every day brought new legal documents, media inquiries, or angry messages from relatives. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Amanda Foster, who specialized in helping people navigate sudden wealth and family conflicts. Our first session was awkward because I felt guilty about complaining about inheriting millions of dollars, but she helped me understand that grief, family dysfunction, and sudden life changes create stress regardless of the financial circumstances. "Victoria gave you a tremendous gift," Dr. Foster said during one of our sessions, "but she also gave you a tremendous burden. You're grieving her death, dealing with family hostility, managing complex financial decisions, and adjusting to a completely different life, all at the same time. It makes sense that you're feeling overwhelmed." She helped me develop strategies for managing the pressure and maintaining perspective. We worked on setting boundaries with family members, dealing with media attention, and making decisions about the inheritance that aligned with my values rather than other people's expectations. One of the most helpful things she taught me was to separate Victoria's intentions from other people's reactions. Victoria made her choice based on her own observations and values, Dr. Foster reminded me. Other people's anger about that choice doesn't make the choice wrong. It just makes them angry. As winter turned to spring, the legal challenges began to lose momentum. Marcus's attorney was having trouble finding any evidence of undue influence or mental incompetency, partly because Victoria had been so thorough in documenting her decision-making process, and partly because the evidence of her family's financial opportunism was so overwhelming. The psychiatric evaluation, the financial audit, the private investigator's report, and Victoria's own detailed logs created a picture of a woman who'd been taken advantage of for years and had finally decided to protect her assets by leaving them to the one person who'd never asked for anything. Marcus's attorney actually advised him to drop the case after reviewing Janet Morrison's evidence file. "You're not going to win this," the lawyer reportedly told him, "and if we go to trial, all of this documentation about your financial relationship with your aunt is going to become public record. Are you sure you want that level of scrutiny?" Sarah's social media campaign also began to backfire when several of Victoria's neighbors and friends started sharing their own stories about my regular visits to help with household maintenance and her obvious appreciation for my company. The narrative of me as a manipulative opportunist became harder to maintain when multiple independent witnesses testified to the genuine nature of my relationship with Victoria. By late spring, the family's organized resistance to my inheritance had mostly collapsed. Marcus dropped his legal challenge and issued a brief statement about respecting Victoria's wishes. Sarah quietly deleted her social media posts about elder abuse and inheritance disputes. Uncle Richard started sending me occasional text messages about family news, carefully avoiding any mention of money or financial assistance. But the real test of my character came when I had to decide what to do with Victoria's wealth. I'd spent months defending my right to inherit it, but now I had to prove that I deserved it by using it responsibly. I started by honoring Victoria's own charitable giving. She'd been a regular donor to several organizations focused on elder care, literacy programs, and local arts education. I continued her annual contributions and increased them significantly, using the investment income from her portfolio to fund grants and scholarships. I also established the Victoria Harper Foundation, focused on providing support for elderly people who were being financially exploited by family members. The foundation funded legal assistance, counseling services, and education programs designed to help seniors protect themselves from unscrupulous relatives and caregivers. But perhaps the most meaningful project was renovating Victoria's house to serve as a community center for seniors in her neighborhood. The large rooms that had once hosted awkward family gatherings became spaces for art classes, book clubs, and social activities. The garden where Victoria had taught me about roses became a therapeutic space where elderly residents could grow vegetables and flowers. I kept one room exactly as Victoria had left it, filled with her books, photographs, and personal mementos. It served as both a memorial to her memory and a reminder of why I'd inherited the responsibility to continue her work. The financial management of the inheritance required careful attention, but Victoria's advisors helped me understand the investment strategies she'd used to build her wealth. The real estate properties generated steady rental income, the stock portfolio provided dividends and growth, and the savings accounts ensured liquidity for unexpected expenses and charitable giving. I discovered that Victoria had been far more sophisticated in her financial planning than anyone in the family had realized. She'd diversified across multiple asset classes, balanced risk and return carefully, and structured her holdings to minimize tax obligations while maximizing long-term growth. Learning to manage this level of wealth was like getting a graduate degree in finance and economics. I spent hours reading investment reports, attending meetings with financial advisors, and studying market trends. But I also tried to remember Victoria's fundamental approach: careful research, conservative risk-taking, and long-term thinking. By the first anniversary of Victoria's death, I'd settled into a routine that balanced honoring her memory with building my own future. I was still living in her house, but I'd made it my own, with new artwork, updated furniture, and a renovated studio where I could pursue my graphic design work without financial pressure. The inheritance had given me something I'd never expected to have: complete financial security and the freedom to make choices based on my interests and values rather than economic necessity. I could take on design projects because they excited me creatively, not because I desperately needed the money. I could travel, explore new hobbies, and invest time in relationships without constantly calculating the cost. But I'd also learned that wealth brings its own set of challenges and responsibilities. People treated me differently now that I had money, and I had to be careful about their motivations. Every financial decision had implications not just for my own future, but for the charitable causes I supported and the people who depended on the foundation's work. The family relationships remained complicated but had stabilized into a new equilibrium. Marcus and I exchanged polite messages on holidays and family occasions, but we weren't close. Sarah had apologized for her social media campaign and occasionally visited the community center, but there was still tension between us. Uncle Richard and I had developed the most genuine relationship, partly because of his honest acknowledgement of how the family had treated Victoria. I realized that Victoria's inheritance was about more than money. She'd given me the opportunity to prove that I could be trusted with responsibility, that my unconventional career path didn't disqualify me from managing complex affairs, and that kindness and loyalty were more valuable than traditional markers of success. But she'd also given me the burden of representing her values and protecting her legacy. Every decision I made reflected on her judgment in choosing me as her heir. Every dollar I spent or invested or donated was a test of whether I understood what she'd been trying to accomplish. As I sat in her garden on a warm spring evening, watching the roses she'd taught me to care for beginning to bloom, I felt the weight of that responsibility, settling into something that felt less like burden and more like purpose. Victoria had trusted me with her life's work, and I was determined to prove worthy of that trust. The second anniversary of Victoria's death approached with less fanfare than the first. I'd grown accustomed to managing her estate, and what had once felt overwhelming now felt like a natural part of my routine. The Victoria Harper Foundation was funding its third year of operations, the community center was thriving, and I'd found my rhythm as someone who could make meaningful decisions with significant resources. But that autumn brought an unexpected visitor who would change everything I thought I understood about Victoria's final years. Dr. Patricia Kellerman appeared at my door on a rainy October morning, introducing herself as a geriatric psychiatrist who had worked with Victoria during her final months. She wasn't the Dr. Chen who had conducted the competency evaluation for the will, and her name wasn't in any of the files Janet Morrison had given me. "I know this is unusual," Dr. Kellerman said as I invited her into the living room that had once been Victoria's domain, "but I've been debating whether to contact you for over a year. I think you deserve to know about the conversations your aunt and I had during her final months." Dr. Kellerman was a small woman in her 60s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with complex family dynamics and difficult emotional situations. As she settled into the chair Victoria used to prefer, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if Victoria herself were about to share some final secret. "Victoria came to see me in March of the year she died," Dr. Kellerman began. "She wasn't referred by a physician or seeking treatment for any psychiatric condition. She made the appointment herself and paid for our sessions out of pocket. She said she needed to talk to someone completely outside her family situation." I leaned forward, intrigued. Victoria had never mentioned seeing a therapist, and there were no records of psychological treatment in any of the files I'd inherited. "What did she want to talk about?" I asked. Dr. Kellerman pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages. She was struggling with what she called the burden of being wealthy among people who weren't. She felt trapped between her natural generosity and her growing awareness that her family saw her primarily as a financial resource. According to Dr. Kellerman, Victoria had been deeply conflicted about her relationships with family members. She loved them genuinely, but she'd become increasingly uncomfortable with the way every interaction seemed to revolve around money. She felt guilty about having so much while they struggled, but she also resented being expected to solve everyone's problems with her checkbook. She talked about feeling like she was disappearing as a person, Dr. Kellerman continued. She said that when people looked at her, they saw dollar signs instead of seeing Victoria. Even well-meaning conversations about her health or living situation felt like asset management discussions rather than expressions of genuine care. Victoria had been particularly troubled by the way her family discussed her future without including her in the conversations. She'd overheard phone calls where relatives speculated about her mental state, her ability to live independently, and the best ways to handle her growing frailty. These discussions always seemed to circle back to concerns about protecting her assets and ensuring proper management of her wealth. She felt like they were planning her life and death around what would be most convenient for their inheritance expectations, Dr. Kellerman explained. She wanted to maintain her independence and dignity, but she also wanted to leave a legacy that reflected her values rather than just rewarding people for being related to her. The most revelatory part of Dr. Kellerman's visit came when she shared Victoria's thoughts about me specifically. According to the therapist, Victoria had talked extensively about our relationship and what made it different from her interactions with other family members. She said you were the only person who seemed to enjoy her company for its own sake, Dr. Kellerman recounted. She talked about how you would spend entire afternoons helping with projects around her house, listening to her stories, asking her opinions about things that had nothing to do with money. She said those interactions made her feel like she still mattered as a person. Victoria had been particularly touched by my willingness to learn from her. She'd mentioned teaching me about gardening, sharing her investment strategies, and discussing books and current events during our regular visits. She saw these conversations as evidence that I valued her knowledge and experience, not just her financial resources. She called you her emotional heir, Dr. Kellerman said with a slight smile. She said that while other family members might inherit her money, you had already inherited her values and her approach to relationships. But Dr. Kellerman also shared some of Victoria's concerns about leaving me such a substantial inheritance. Victoria had worried that the money might change me, that I might become the kind of person who saw wealth as an entitlement rather than a responsibility. She'd also been concerned about how the family would treat me after her death, knowing that their anger and resentment could be destructive. She spent considerable time during our sessions working through her decision, Dr. Kellerman revealed. She wanted to make sure she was making the choice for the right reasons, not out of spite or disappointment with other family members. She ultimately concluded that leaving her wealth to you was the best way to ensure it would be used according to her values. This conversation with Dr. Kellerman gave me new insight into Victoria's state of mind during her final months. She hadn't just been organizing her affairs and preparing for death. She'd been grappling with complex emotions about family, money, and legacy. Her decision to leave everything to me wasn't impulsive or vindictive, but the result of careful consideration and professional counseling. After Dr. Kellerman left, I spent hours walking through the house and garden, thinking about what she'd shared. I felt a renewed sense of responsibility to honor Victoria's intentions, but I also felt the weight of her expectations. She hadn't just given me her money, she'd trusted me to represent her values and continue her work in the world. That winter, I made a decision that would have surprised the old Daniel, the one who'd been content to drift through life without clear direction or ambitious goals. I enrolled in a master's program in nonprofit management at Portland State University, determined to build the skills I needed to maximize the impact of Victoria's charitable legacy. The program was challenging for someone who'd never been academically ambitious, but I found myself energized by subjects like organizational leadership, fundraising strategies, and program evaluation. For the first time in my adult life, I was studying something because I wanted to excel at it, not just because I needed to get through it. My graduate program required a capstone project, and I chose to research and document Victoria's approach to wealth management and charitable giving. The project involved interviewing her former financial advisors, reviewing decades of investment records, and analyzing the outcomes of her various philanthropic efforts. What I discovered was remarkable. Victoria had been incredibly sophisticated in her approach to building and preserving wealth, but she'd also been deeply thoughtful about using that wealth responsibly. She'd consistently donated significant percentages of her income to charity, supported local businesses and community development efforts, and made investment decisions that balanced financial returns with social impact. She'd also been much more generous with family members than anyone realized. The $400,000 in loans and gifts that Janet Morrison had documented was only part of the story. Victoria had also quietly paid for educational expenses, provided emergency assistance during medical crises, and supported family members' business ventures in ways that weren't formally recorded. But she'd done all of this discreetly, without expecting gratitude or recognition. She hadn't wanted to be seen as the family benefactor, partly because she valued her independence and partly because she understood that financial dependence could damage relationships. My research project became the foundation for a book about responsible wealth management that was published by a university press the year after I graduated. The book used Victoria's story as a case study in how inherited wealth could be used to strengthen communities while preserving family relationships. It wasn't a bestseller, but it was adopted as a textbook in several nonprofit management and family therapy programs. Writing the book also helped me process my own relationship with Victoria's legacy. I realized that she'd been teaching me about responsible stewardship throughout our years of working together in her garden and around her house. The patience required for nurturing plants, the long-term thinking needed for maintaining property, the attention to detail necessary for managing complex systems, these skills translated directly to managing wealth and running a foundation. 5 years after Victoria's death, the community center that bore her name had become a model for senior programming that was being replicated in other cities. The foundation had distributed over $2 million in grants and had funded research that was influencing policy discussions about elder care and family support services. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of success was less quantifiable. The neighborhood around Victoria's house had become a more connected, supportive community. Seniors who might otherwise have been isolated were participating in activities and forming friendships. Families were learning to communicate more effectively about caregiving responsibilities and financial planning. I'd also found my own path forward. The uncertain, drifting young man who'd been dismissed as the family failure had become someone who could lead complex organizations, make strategic decisions, and inspire others to pursue meaningful work. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy, but it had been authentic. My relationship with money had evolved as well. The inheritance that had initially felt like both a blessing and a burden had become simply a tool for accomplishing important work. I lived comfortably but not extravagantly, traveled when I wanted to, and never worried about basic financial security. But I also never forgot that the money was Victoria's, earned through her hard work and careful planning, entrusted to me for purposes larger than my own comfort. The family relationships continued to evolve slowly. Marcus eventually remarried and seemed less bitter about the inheritance situation, though we still rarely spoke directly. Sarah's daughter started volunteering at the community center and developed a genuine interest in elder care advocacy. Uncle Richard became a regular supporter of the foundation's work and occasionally shared stories about Victoria that helped me understand her more completely. The most unexpected development came from my mother, who had been largely absent from the inheritance drama but had maintained a disapproving silence about my windfall. 3 years after Victoria's death, she was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease and needed assistance managing her own affairs. Instead of asking other family members for help, she called me. Our relationship had been strained for years, partly because of my unconventional career choices and partly because of long-standing personality conflicts. But facing her own vulnerability seemed to give her new perspective on Victoria's final years and my role as a caregiver. I helped my mother navigate the healthcare system, organize her legal and financial documents, and plan for her changing needs. The process was emotionally difficult, but it also provided opportunities for honest conversations we'd never had before. She admitted that she'd been jealous of Victoria's wealth and independence, and that she'd encouraged other family members to see me as unsuccessful because she was disappointed in her own life choices. "Victoria saw something in you that I missed," my mother told me during one of our trips to her doctor's appointments. She understood that success isn't just about making money or having a prestigious career. It's about being the kind of person others can depend on. Caring for my mother also taught me new lessons about the responsibilities that come with resources and capability. Victoria had been wealthy and independent, but she'd still needed someone to see her as a person rather than an asset. My mother was struggling financially and losing her cognitive abilities, but she still needed dignity, respect, and genuine care. I used some of Victoria's inheritance to ensure my mother could remain in her own home with appropriate support services, and I arranged for her to participate in programs at the community center. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using money I'd inherited from one family member to care for another family member who'd initially resented my good fortune. But the experience also reinforced lessons Victoria had been trying to teach me about the difference between charity and care. Simply writing checks to solve problems wasn't enough. Real care required time, attention, emotional investment, and willingness to see people as complex individuals rather than collections of needs to be met. The 7th anniversary of Victoria's death was marked by a celebration at the community center that drew over 200 people. There were seniors who participated in programs, families who'd been helped by the foundation's services, staff members and volunteers, and even some former neighbors who'd moved away but returned for the event. Uncle Richard spoke about Victoria's impact on the neighborhood and her vision for supporting community connections. Dr. Kellerman, who'd become an informal advisor to the foundation, talked about Victoria's commitment to maintaining dignity and independence for aging adults. Several program participants shared stories about how the center had enriched their lives and helped them build new friendships. But the moment that affected me most deeply came when Mrs. Chen, an 84-year-old woman who'd been participating in the center's program since it opened, stood up to speak. She talked about being widowed and isolated after her husband's death, about feeling invisible and irrelevant in a youth-oriented culture, and about finding purpose and community through the center's activities. "This place saved my life," she said simply, "not because I was dying, but because I was disappearing. Victoria Harper created something here that makes people like me visible again." After the celebration, I walked through the garden that Victoria and I had tended together. The roses were dormant for winter, but the structure of the bed she'd planned was still clear. In spring, new growth would emerge from the roots we'd established together, continuing cycles of renewal that neither of us would see completed. I thought about the journey, from that day at the funeral when my family had called me a parasite, to this evening when I was surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by Victoria's legacy. The money had been important, certainly, but it had been Victoria's values, her vision, and her trust in my character that had made the real difference. Standing in that garden, I realized that Victoria's greatest gift hadn't been the $15 million or the 3 properties. It had been the opportunity to discover who I could become when someone believed in my potential and gave me resources to fulfill it. She'd seen possibilities in me that I hadn't seen in myself, and she'd structured her inheritance to help those possibilities become reality. The family that had once dismissed me as a failure now had to acknowledge that I'd built something meaningful with the opportunities Victoria had provided. But more importantly, I'd proven to myself that their early judgments about my character and capabilities had been wrong. I wasn't the family parasite they'd labeled me. I was Victoria's chosen heir, worthy of her trust and capable of honoring her legacy. As I locked up the community center and headed home to the house that had once been Victoria's sanctuary, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the unexpected path my life had taken. The inheritance had given me financial security and social impact beyond anything I could have achieved on my own. But it had also given me something more valuable, the knowledge that love, loyalty, and genuine care for others are investments that pay dividends across generations. Victoria's money would eventually be spent on charitable causes and community programs. The properties would eventually be sold or repurposed for other uses. But the relationships, values, and systems of care we'd built together would continue long after I was gone, touching lives and strengthening communities in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars or counted in assets. That night, I sat at Victoria's old kitchen table and wrote letters to each member of my family, sharing updates about the foundation's work and expressing gratitude for the ways they'd contributed to Victoria's life over the years. I didn't offer them money or try to solve their problems, but I did try to acknowledge their importance in Victoria's story and their potential roles in continuing her work. Some of them responded positively, others didn't respond at all, and a few sent polite but distant acknowledgments. But I'd learned that my responsibility wasn't to control their reactions or repair all the damage from years of complicated family dynamics. My responsibility was to honor Victoria's trust by using her resources wisely and maintaining her values in my own relationships and decisions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.